Well, good afternoon, good evening. I have to say that you are the stalwarts, and everyone else is missing out on a real treat. I'm Catherine Marshall. I'm a senior fellow at the Berkeley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs. And we're very happy to host this event in collaboration with our longtime partners, the Pulitzer Center. We are honored today to welcome Anton Delgado. I asked him where he's from. He's from the Philippines. I should have guessed. An award-winning freelance multimedia journalist. We'll hear more about the awards later. Whose investigative reporting has brought critical attention to environmental crises across Southeast Asia. Over the past 3 years, with support from the Pulitzer Center's Rainforest Investigations Network and Rainforest Journalism Fund, Anton has uncovered the realities of forest crimes in the region, documenting religious activism in Cambodia, the removal of war remnants in the Mekong Delta, and the ongoing demand for natural resources that continues to reshape Southeast Asia's landscapes. His work has led to major collaborative projects, including When Forests Fall Silent, a deep investigation into Southeast Asia's snaring crisis, his forthcoming investigation into the devastating impact of gold mining on rainforest ecosystems, set to be published in the New York Times, was the keystone for a groundbreaking collaboration with the University of Cambridge's Digital Humanities School, using drone footage and digital mapping to expose the true scale of environmental destruction. Today's event will begin with a presentation from Anton, after which I will join him on stage for a discussion, and then we'll open the floor for questions, so I hope you all will have a lot of questions. The topic is one that really, you might not have guessed why. I should ask you to guess why the Berkeley Center is so interested in these topics. But we have a long set of intersections. First of all, Cambodia has been a country where we've worked intensively, basically with the Berkeley Center, or my central question, which is what's religion got to do with it? And there are fascinating stories in Cambodia, so I'm looking forward to hearing more. And secondly, we're very much involved with a very interesting global initiative on the climate, which is the Interfaith Rainforest Initiative, which is working in the Amazon, in the Congo Basin, and in Southeast Asia, particularly Indonesia, in trying to bring the potential of religious actors to make a difference on climate change into the focus. So with that, as background, Anton will speak for about a half hour, I think, and then we'll move on to the discussion and questions and answers. So welcome, Anton. Oh, and I should say, this is being recorded, so the recording will be available afterwards.
Thank you so much for coming on a Monday afternoon, especially in such nice weather. I really appreciate it. Since there are not too many of us, I figured I might zoom past this presentation in the hopes that we could have a more friendly conversation afterwards. But in brief, my goal today wasn't to turn anyone into an environmental correspondent or encourage anybody to become a journalist. I just wanted to do kind of a cocktail tasting of some of the reporting that we've done with the Pulitzer Center over the past 3 years that intersect with a lot of the topics being discussed here in Georgetown. So yes, as was mentioned, my name's Anton. I'm originally from the Philippines. I spent 7 years in the States studying and then moved to Cambodia to begin my reporting career. So I'm hoping that this presentation will be of interest to both people who want to be journalists, but also folks that are interested in religion, global affairs, supply chains, and most importantly, Southeast Asia. As always, especially since we're here at Georgetown, I like beginning with my villain origin story and what got me into reporting. I had always thought I'd wanted to be a journalist, but never got to practice it until I went to Elon University. So like a lot of your student reporters here, I cut my teeth in student news. And my time frame in the States was really fascinating. My first semester was President Trump's first inauguration, and I ended in May of 2020 during the COVID-19 outbreak. So a really interesting time to break into the news, and this is what kind of set my mindset to being interested in international media and international coverage and foreign correspondence. So if there are any student journalists in the room, I always like starting on that note. Naturally, the media is in a very tough spot, so I also like keeping a humble slide. And when I graduated in May of 2020, I had 90 days to find a media job, and I didn't find one until the 71st day. So more than 70 job applications later, and more than 70 rejections later, I was nervous. And because of this experience, my rule is whenever I hit rock bottom, I take a selfie and I file it in a folder. So that whenever I look successful, I'm on giving a presentation, I look back at that picture and I remember where I came from. So for all the folks that are interested in media and want to be journalists, it can absolutely be done. There are just a lot of ups and downs that we have to figure out throughout our careers. So I guess this is specifically to all of our student journalists and anyone who's aspiring to go into media in the future. But yes, one of my absolutely favorite photos. And I guess I bring that up because it always leads to good times. And because of all that struggle in 2020, I was able to collaborate with the Pulitzer Center. And we've been now together, Anne, for what, 5 years? Since my student reporting fellowship. And that's led to investigations in Brazil, in Vietnam, in Cambodia. Hopefully soon, depending on how Anne feels, it might lead me to Micronesia. We'll talk about that later this week. And that's covered a whole range of topics, which I'm going to get into today. I do want to clarify, naturally, when you think about global, collaborative, environmental investigations, it's usually not always the most positive. So I guess I like to preempt this talk by saying that Cambodia absolutely lives up to its name as the Kingdom of Wonder. It's one of the most beautiful countries in Southeast Asia, and it's been my adopted home for the past 3 years. So not only do we have these stunning landscapes and the Mekong Basin and the Tonle Sap Lake and of course the Angkor Wat temples, it does naturally mean that there are a lot of challenges to these areas and natural resources. So I think both of those can exist, and I can't stress that enough. Unfortunately, when you give a couple of these presentations, everyone just focuses on the negative of a country, and I don't think that's fair at all. So I can't stress enough that while there are a great deal of challenges, both in Cambodia and in Southeast Asia, the country also has so much to offer. And I always encourage folks to go on and visit themselves and hopefully get to see it. So I figured I'd start with our largest, longest, and most surprising international investigation with the Pulitzer Center, which was not at all our original plan. So it was actually focused on the global primate trade that stems out of Cambodia and lands here in the States. I always start with the story inception because folks will ask me, how did you pitch this 3-year-long, thousands of dollars worth investigation that went with NBC and Straits Times? And the real answer is I have no idea. I was in Cambodia, and my goal was to write a couple of interesting, unique slice-of-life features. So I wanted to write about these influencers who follow long-tailed macaques, this type of monkey, around Angkor Wat, and they film the monkey all day long. And then they generate, thousands of views of people interested in monkeys. So I went out, I'm talking to these guys, and they all make fun of me because I'm talking about how this is, it's kind of like a monkey business. And they all laugh, and they say, this isn't Cambodia's actual monkey business. And it turns out through that Cambodia is actually the world's leading exporter of long-tailed macaques. And this skyrocketed after COVID-19. And I think something that caught my attention to this was, of course, when somebody mentions this to me, you're thinking 50, 60, couple hundred macaques. We're talking thousands. And this skyrocketed after the outbreak of COVID-19 because the Chinese trade in long-tailed macaques collapsed. And naturally, COVID-19 led to the need for a lot of pharmaceutical experimentations in the hopes of getting a vaccine for COVID. And that all stemmed out of Cambodia. So these are actually pictures not only of an infant long-tailed macaque, which during the time of my reporting went from around $2,000 per head to $22,000, just to show how much how lucrative this trade was. And then these are actually 2 of our macaque farms. So I think I just wanted to show the scale of what we're talking about, which surprised every single editor that I pitched this to. And actually, these are a couple of our numbers. So what was most odd and perhaps suspicious about the long-tailed macaque trade in Cambodia was that it doubled over the course of a year, which biologically for macaques does not make a lot of sense, especially if you're going through the United Nations regulations for shipping macaques. I think something that's important to note is that the wildlife trade, especially this one, is 100% legal. You can breed, farm, and export macaques for pharmaceutical uses. There are just a ton of rules that you're supposed to be following. Unfortunately, I think with the amount of cash that was flowing into this and the amount of demand from the States, a lot of those rules started to bend, and that's what this investigation led to. So you can actually see some of the charts that we created with the Pulitzer Center that just shows this massive skyrocket over the course of 12 months, which again, biologically is not possible. And that started that's kind of what started the investigation. And I think something that I'll plug here is that all of this is publicly available data. We just don't have enough reporters following these topics to request this data, download it, put it into an Excel sheet, and see these trends. So I think that's going to be, unfortunately, something that becomes more common as both academia and reporters, the amount of focus on these topics is shrinking, unfortunately. And I do worry about what this would mean, because even though not a lot of data is available, the small amount that we do have can lead to pretty groundbreaking discoveries. And yes, so this landed us in Bloomberg, NBC, the Toronto Star, all because of the fact that people were interested in this idea of a Southeast Asian supply chain to the States, and especially because it had to do with COVID-19. So when we pitched this to NBC, they were flabbergasted that almost all of the American-produced vaccines benefited from long-tailed macaque experimentation. And then on top of that, the likelihood, and what we discovered was the amount of wildlife trafficking that was going through this legal trade was exceedingly dangerous for the pharmaceutical industry. So the macaques that we were supposedly breeding and exporting that had been carefully bred in a controlled environment and then sent to the States to be tested on, we were filtering in wild-caught macaques, which changes the entire game. Which is why NBC was really interested in the story. We worked with a newsroom in Singapore because every macaque flew from Cambodia to Singapore to the States. So they naturally got interested in that angle of the supply chain. And then naturally Bloomberg, because of the money and the billions of dollars in the macaque trade, wanted a piece of this. And then lastly, it wound up with the Toronto Star of all places because our reporting contributed to a subpoena for some of the companies that were unknowingly or knowingly bringing in these wild-caught macaques to the States. The subpoena paused the entire trade. But then we immediately saw a huge spike of macaque imports into Toronto and Quebec. So naturally, we took the story, we went straight to the Toronto Star, and we said, hey, we've been investigating this for 2 years. It looks like we just jumped borders. And the same company that's been doing this here in the States is now doing this elsewhere and avoiding the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service subpoena. So that's why this really exploded in that sense. The simple story that I wrote about once turned into a 3-year-long investigation. And I'd say my biggest lesson learned from that was the idea of supply chain reporting impacting everybody. Like if we could interest Canadian editors, Singaporean editors, American editors, and of course my editors in Cambodia, because of the idea that this whole supply chain is so interconnected and millions of people not only benefited from this, but paid for it, you could really take these, I guess you would say, niche stories and bring them to a global audience. So for my first few years in Cambodia, that was like a critical lesson of understanding how to engage different editors and newsrooms. Because unfortunately, I'd say the focus on countries like Cambodia ebbs and flows. So finding ways to talk about it that matter to local audiences was really key. Naturally, we were speaking about religion and interfaith. So one of the stories that we did for the Pulitzer Center focused on this final intact forest near the capital of Cambodia, Phnom Penh. And unfortunately, we're building a new airport, and it was decided that housing and malls and infrastructure to support that new airport was more important than this last piece of intact forest, which also happened to be a wildlife rescue center and the National Zoo. So there were a lot of different issues, but unfortunately, they decided that the need for the airport was greater than for the environment. So we launched this huge investigation into, I guess what you would say, passing for protection, these paper parks. While legally all of this was not allowed, suddenly we were okay with building this great amount of infrastructure for this new airport. And naturally, one of the main characters that I was introduced to through this piece was a local monk. And this is actually exceedingly common in Cambodia, but somewhat rare throughout the region, was the idea that monks were leading different types of environmental activism throughout the country. And we'd seen this in the past, but this was the first time that it had gotten so politicized, because usually monks would be fighting illegal deforestation, wildlife poaching, and these other issues. For the first time, the monks were fighting the government and folks that really wanted to build and make money off of massive infrastructure developments. So that kind of elevated the risks of all of our reporting. And it was a really telling and beautiful story and explanation of how Buddhism relates to the environment and how the Buddhist faith was so tied to the environment in so many ways. And naturally, when he was bringing together folks for peaceful protests and demonstrations against this, he would always say, Buddha found enlightenment under a tree. How will we ever do that if we cut down all of our trees? And it did sway public opinion to the point that they actually did cancel the development. Heartbreakingly, we lost about half the forest before that was done, but it is now being reforested. And I guess that was my lesson learned from this. Naturally, there was so much bad press from cutting down a protected area near the capital where kids go to see, elephants and endangered animals, that they reversed it and they said, super sorry about that. We're going to reforest the whole thing, and it'll be like nothing ever happened. Super unfortunately, they decided to reforest it with high luxury timber trees like rosewood, and the reforestation did not go super well. So I think that was my lesson learned from this piece, was always follow up and don't believe the PR response. While the press releases all said we're reforesting and we're going to regrow this great forest, by continuing to cover it, we uncovered a lot of other issues with the reforestation. And that is all thanks to, I guess, the Pulitzer Center's belief to continue covering the story. Naturally, media now, we change stories every second. The Pulitzer Center really does believe on those follow-ups. Like, okay, you said you were reforesting. What happened 6 months, 12 months, 18 months later? And the support of the Pulitzer Center allows newsrooms like mine to kind of continue to do that. And I guess most recently in the news, we've been covering the remnants of war removal in Southeast Asia. So it's been 50 years since the end of the Vietnam War, which naturally led to the fall of Cambodia, to the Khmer Rouge, which led to one of our worst genocides this century, which eventually led to a longer civil war, which now led to peace. And then, of course, this led to the communist takeover both in Vietnam and Laos. And throughout that entire period, these countries, unfortunately, were not only heavily landmined, but heavily bombed by the US throughout this conflict to kind of curb communism. And historically, the US has done a really noble job of continuing to fund and remove remnants of war. So this has been something that's gone through the State Department and USAID, so landmine risk education, UXO removals, all of this has been funded consistently for the states, and to a massive degree. The US funds 96% of Laotian UXO removal. That's, all of it. The US funds, I think, about 30% of Vietnam and about 60% of Cambodia. So it was a healthy contribution to this really historic issue that I think folks, while it sounds bad, generally folks really dismiss. And I can't stress how much this changes every aspect of a country's development. We cannot send folks to build roads if there are landmine concerns. We cannot build schools. Students are learning about UXOs rather than learning English and learning other languages, and this actively causes casualties monthly. We have a monthly report of how many folks have lost their lives or limbs in all of our nations because of this conflict that ended supposedly 50 years ago. So it's hard to stress, I guess, how significant of an impact this has had on the development of our nations. And then on top of this, half the UXOs in the Mekong and the Tonle Sap, and it does get exceedingly complicated. And how do you remove this safely and keep both deminers and the public alive? Unfortunately, this was all cut at the start of the 90-day freeze for American foreign aid. I'd say where we are right now is still absolutely super confused. So all of the aid was frozen immediately because China announced that they would be stepping in to fund demining in Cambodia. The US reversed the aid freeze and supposedly is now channeling funds back to Cambodia, Laos, and Vietnam. We haven't gotten confirmation of if those funds have made it or how they're going to be used, or in what way, if it's fully back and it's like nothing ever changed, or if actually you only have it for the rest of the year. And this has just really sent the entire humanitarian demining industry into a flux, because not only are they hiring hundreds of deminers and UXO experts, but it also is leaving folks uncertain of if they need to find alternative sources of funding. So that's been an ongoing story that a lot of American outlets have been interested in, naturally, because of its ties to the White House, and of course recent politics here in DC. So yes, those pieces were covered by the New York Times and NBC, and I do think that this will continue to be covered, especially as we hit this massive anniversary for the Vietnam War. Naturally, this led to follow-up coverage specifically about Agent Orange in Vietnam. This has led to follow-up coverage of what does Lao do now? If almost 100% of Laotian UXO removal was funded by the states, can anybody step into that hole? Or will we have to learn to live with this and kind of give up the idea of a landmine-free future, which has now just been set back about 5 years? So a really complicated topic that I think has resonated with a lot of folks. I think there have been a lot of veteran associations that have come out to speak about this. A lot of former ambassadors have talked about how this, I guess, coming to terms with history has been a touching point with a lot of governments that haven't always been friendly with the states. So the Laotian government is communist and obviously through their history has not been a huge fan, but funding for issues like this has been a huge touching point for different governments with the US and has led to a lot of different initiatives and soft power moves that experts and folks that I've spoken to have said might be lost as we continue to figure out what this all means. I think my lesson learned from this was, despite covering landmines and unexploded ordnance and having all the best risk management, you can still definitely get hurt doing this. And I think that was my big takeaway. I thought, wow, the riskiest thing I've ever done was definitely covering a landmine field and being out with unexploded ordnance teams as they're trying to find explosives. No, I didn't get hurt at all. I got hurt doing a bunch of other stuff. So I think while the Pulitzer Center does train us to be as risk managed as possible, there are always risks. And I think that's something that for folks that do a lot of field reporting, the idea of risk management indexes, safety measures, having fail-safe communication systems, that's something that the Pulitzer Center trains all of us to do, which unfortunately most journalists don't get. So a lot of folks like me are going out without risk management training, without safety protocols, and getting really hurt in the field doing this type of work. So again, if anyone's really interested in that, I think that's a whole separate conversation of how do you risk manage these trips, because the risks don't mean that these stories shouldn't be covered. Like, we do need folks taking these risks and managing them correctly so that we can safely do our jobs. But yes, can be a cause of concern at time, and certainly has stressed out my mom over the course of her life. Lastly, we can't talk about it too much, unfortunately, because it's not been published, but perhaps something that we can discuss more during our conversation. Our ongoing project is a boots on the ground meets eyes in the sky collaboration between myself and artificial intelligence. So we worked with the University of Cambridge as well as our partners at Earth Genome to develop a system that was able to map and identify a plot of land that looked like a gold mine. And it was able to exponentially expand that across all of Cambodia and sent us back a list of most likely places that are illegal gold mines. And that's where I came in and had to ground truth all of that. So that was, I guess, the project overall. So Mondulkiri is one of the provinces where this is the most impacted, and it has a known and long history of gold mining. So we took satellite imagery of Mondulkiri, and that's what we expanded across the country. And a total mixed bag. It was a really interesting collaboration. It did make my life and my job a lot safer, because instead of me blindly walking through the jungle hoping to come across illegal gold mines, which I wouldn't overarchingly recommend, we were able to target where we were going and approach it more safely. So naturally we had drones, naturally we moved at different times of day, just to make sure that the people that we were running across and the places that we were going, we were doing so in the safest possible manner. And without artificial intelligence kind of dictating and supporting that trip, that would have been much riskier. So I feel overarchingly torn, as I think all of the media industry does, about what AI is going to do to journalism. But at least my main takeaway from this was there are ways to collaborate with artificial intelligence that could make our lives safer. But naturally, there are longer conversations about security, privacy, and what the environmental impact of AI processing could be, and of course, the exponential ability for AI to produce fake news and misinformation that journalists, I think, we're going to have a hard time keeping up with and countering over the next few years. So yes, this is one of the massive industrial gold mines that we came across, and then previously were some of the artisanal gold mines. And the story will kind of focus on this industry versus traditional gold mining, and how the race for what's left of Cambodia's forests is leading to massive environmental degradation. So out in the New York Times, supposedly in the next 2 months, hopefully. We'll see what happens. Naturally, earthquakes and executive orders and everything else keep changing and pushing back publication times. So we will see, but I'm excited to get that piece finally out for Anne in the Pulitzer Center. But yes, I just wanted to leave it at that. I know I rushed through that briefly, but I thought with there not being too many of us, I thought perhaps we could have more of a conversation afterwards. Yes, please.
Great. Well, thanks so much. That was fascinating. I'm going to start with a story. Maybe you can cover my story. But one of the one of the horrible tragedies in Cambodia is the number of people who've been seriously injured by landmines. And a lot of people, you see them, have their legs missing, and children and adults and so forth. But there was a hospital in Battambang that was, I think, funded by an Italian NGO that was really for landmine survivors. And then there weren't enough. There weren't enough injuries. And so the Italian NGO said, we're leaving. However, the Japanese religious leader decided to come in and take over the hospital. But the hospital's now for road accidents. So you have the evolution from with the development of Cambodia, from having the landmine tragedies to road accident tragedies.
I think overarchingly it is a positive. We were clearing more land and more landscapes than ever. Like we've really developed new technologies that can somewhat safely remove and destroy landmines and UXO. Unfortunately, what that looks like in the future and where the funding will go is a mixed bag. And there's certainly a group of folks that believe that it's time for governments like Cambodia to step up and kind of see the job through to the end, since the majority of the country has been cleared. But yes, I think as all of our countries slowly approach, I guess, development, I'm curious what the future of U.S. and international foreign aid will look like to countries like Cambodia that have been very dependent on it since the UN mission.
Well, I have a whole slew of questions, but let me start with maybe what the biggest one is. You, I presume, are in this because you care about protecting the environment and making a difference. So how do you see the kind of journalism you're doing having an effect? What are the different channels, and what are the strong points and maybe the less positive ones?
Yeah, I think our strongest points is because we're reporting in countries where the press freedoms are so limited, there is a lot of appetite for news from places like Cambodia, which is why you're able to partner with major organizations like NBC, because they don't have foreign correspondents there or bureaus there. And that's where the Pulitzer Center really comes in, because the whole point is like undercovered countries and regions. So I'd say that's a strong point, and we can really reach much larger audiences than my local newsroom back in Cambodia. I'd say the weak side to that is, unfortunately, when you start reporting for international and American audiences, you oftentimes don't report for local audiences. So we tried to counter that with translations and making sure our investigations were available in local languages, and that had mixed results. So I think there has been a lot of impact, because of these stories. They've been mentioned in subpoenas and court cases. We were able to, not that it was inherently the intention, but we were able to, the Prime Minister did come in and stop the forest development that I was mentioning. And frankly, I don't always feel that my job is to go out there and stop these different types of developments. I think the Macaque project was a good example. I don't think the Pulitzer Center and I set out in the hopes of stopping the primate trade globally. We just wanted to make sure that if we were going to trade wildlife and we were going to say that it was legal and above board, it had to be. So I think the idea of like transparency in a region where that's perhaps not the most common is a huge plus.
But what would you, if you had to answer the question, which is a tricky one, but what do you think makes the most difference in trying to change people's hearts and minds so that they care about the destruction of the forest, for example? Is it human interest? Is it sort of uncovering the evil?
I think it would be guilt. I think human interest, kind of, but I would say the reason why the Macaque project really took off is people felt personally guilty for benefiting from this directly. So I'd say that's what led to a lot of the change, because I think citizens were suddenly concerned, and of course when you mentioned that potentially some of the wildlife that we were experimenting on were wild and not captive bred, that made people personally concerned about their own health and safety. So I'd say that's usually what's led to the most impact, and then dollar bills. When you can say that this is causing this much damage, or this is worth this, and that's why we're sacrificing this forest or this landscape or this number of species, suddenly ambassadors start to care, and think tanks start sending you emails and asking you where you got your numbers. And I'd say those are usually the stories where I get the most feedback, either publicly or privately, is when we personally make people feel guilty for I guess, the American supply chain. And then when we add really big dollar bills to things. I'd say that's more often than not, that's where I start getting responses from the State Department, from different embassies abroad, from other countries that are interested in our coverage of the US. So yeah, I guess it's
Well, you addressed it in part, but of course, the Berkeley Center, the question is, what's religion got to do with it? So I'm interested both in the angle that you focused on, which was the role of the monks. And maybe you could talk a little bit more about how that played out.
Yeah.
And what other stories might you have found that, did you get into the evangelicals or the Catholic Church or refugee resettlement or any of the other areas?
That would be the hope. I think a lot of those groups are actually coming into play more so now than ever, especially with aid changing. I think for this particular story, what I was most fascinated with was how this particular monk was trying to balance, not getting arrested. And it was the idea of how can we use religion to peacefully advocate, but not be seen as an activist, because in a lot of our countries that can lead to a lot of issues, and frankly in this one as well. And it was his way of using scripture and the teachings of Buddha to protect the forest, which I thought was really, really interesting. And I think that has happened in other nations. Like I'm sure, in the Philippines we have priests and other folks that are environmentally conscious. But the idea of monks doing this and physically wrapping their robes around trees to keep people from cutting it down, it was so much more, I guess, tangible. And them leading groups on prayer into the forest to protect it, really, I thought, made a huge difference. And if anything, I think that might have changed that narrative more than anything else that was done. The idea that people who were deeply religious suddenly started associating their forests with their religion and their connection to the world.
Well, this was really, as you told it, I think, a story of one monk and one monastery. How do you see that more broadly? Did you sense that it was just sort of the individuals, or that there was some way it was organized, or that somebody might promote some kind of organization?
I think there's absolutely space for organization. I think what I'm worried about is the number of people who are willing to put themselves in harm's way, who are willing to be branded as a dissident or an activist, is limited in our region, because we've struggled with that in the past. I would say that what was fascinating was how the small pagoda of 8 monks were able to use Facebook and Telegram, which are our 2 main largest channels, to get millions of hits on their views. So people who were in the provinces that had never been to Phnom Tamao were able to use social media and get a boots on the ground look at what was happening. So I thought that was pretty fascinating as well, and I wonder if that will become more common. I think we're just at the age where media is so accessible, and people can reach, I would say normal citizens could reach audiences just as fast as I could as a reporter. So I'm curious if that's going to be the organizer. Like we won't need organizations to step in to unify these movements. We'll just need different social media platforms to kind of connect.
Were you ever able to track some of the social media links with? I remember somebody saying there were sort of the 10 largest social media influencers, 3 were religious or something like that. I don't remember the number.
Our largest religious influencer in Cambodia is a really buff monk, and he goes by Buff Monk Khmer. So I'm not sure if that's who we're focused on, but yeah, I'd say that at the moment we're still at the stage where we'd rather see, actresses and singers and dancers. But I do think that a lot of older institutions like the pagodas and the church are starting to look at social media as a new way to adapt. But I'd say that's still developing, at least from what I've seen on that side.
What about within the sort of Buddhist, I know the International Network of Engaged Buddhists and Sulak Sivaraksa, they ordain trees. I guess it's basically the same principle, but have you heard of many other examples? I know there's some in Thailand at least.
Yes, I guess the most common practice that we see in Cambodia is people will build spirit houses into the tree and say that we've officially housed lost spirits in these trees, and that, while of course doesn't protect it always from deforestation or wildlife crimes, it does send a shiver down the spine of most folks. Like that, I think thanks to the influence of Buddhism on Cambodia, folks are pretty hesitant to cut down a tree with a spirit house in it. So I would say I don't think I've seen anything as organized as like it is now officially, ordained or protected spiritually, but that smaller way of each individual pagoda putting up spirit houses in like 1,000 trees or 2,000 trees is how I guess I've seen that play out.
The other example that we were fascinated by was that the avoided reforestation, the RED, that they need to, the government, I guess, commits itself to not cutting down certain amount of forest, but that has to be verified. And they're using monks with GPS devices to prove that the forest is still there in parts of Cambodia.
Yeah, I think it's fantastic because I think a part of the training for most monks is to separate from society. So monks will have, I guess, separate satellite pagodas in like the deepest parts of the jungle, which is absolutely stunning. And usually when we're out doing our reporting, we take refuge in different pagodas that are in exceedingly remote places. And it's not because they preach to the public, it's because this is where monks go to separate and to focus on their spirituality. So I do think that there is a very special role that they can continue to play. I do know that, like, unfortunately, calling out the government on things like deforestation and stuff is not always the most welcome. So I do think that's a balance that everyone has to play.
Yeah, you did talk quite a bit about security, and some of it is not walking in a minefield. But what about some of the other kinds of security, including not getting arrested, I guess, and put in jail or whatever?
It is a huge concern. I think, the Philippines is infamous for hurting, harming, and killing journalists, as are many of our countries in Southeast Asia, Cambodia being included in that. I'd say the way that I divide concerns is environmental concerns and people concerns. So in Cambodia, dengue, malaria, bad road conditions, all concerns that we can risk manage. And then the people concerns are split into two. The people that you run into in the place, which I would say are usually the most dangerous, because reporters will go missing. We've had Pulitzer Center fellows get really hurt, and because they ran across a group that decided it's easier to get rid of you than to let you go back and tell your story. And then there's the people side where you're back in your office and you're filing your story and you're getting threats of legal action, threats of arrest. Our newsroom was unfortunately closed in the lead up to our latest set of elections in Cambodia. So absolutely, I think there are a ton of threats, and unfortunately, I think we are getting better at managing them, but I haven't seen a lot of places where those threats are diminishing. If anything, I think we're at a time where it's easier to challenge media, and people align better with, I guess, not agreeing with a lot of what reporters are doing. So yeah, I think certainly in Southeast Asia, it's a huge concern.
Well, I confess I have lots more questions, but let's turn to the stalwart people who are here. So who'd like to jump in? Okay, we've got Amy first.
So appreciate you guys being here on a Monday. I know Mondays are always a tough start to the week.
We talked a lot about social media and sort of the role of monks, how you first got into the whole macaque story via monkey influencers. And I was just wondering, again, speaking, from the position of the United States, there was Mudang was viral around the world, and like, how adorable, don't we want to save the environment because we need to preserve future Mudangs? I was wondering if that sort of cutesy animal influencer stereotype has played a role in your work, or if you see that also playing a role in environmental protection and inspiring people to care more.
Absolutely. I think my problem as a freelancer is no one will hire a freelancer to cover that because they want to cover it. So orchids are the most traded flora, in the world. And we specifically passed an Orchid Protection Act in Cambodia because a penis-shaped orchid had gone viral, and people were, taking pictures with it and posting and making jokes about the shape of a very specific orchid in Cambodia. And it was such a phenomenon that the government decided, oh geez, like they're just gonna take all of them. People find this so funny that we just need to set a law that, please, you can absolutely take a picture of these funny orchids, but let's just protect everything across the board. So that led to an Orchid Protection Act, which no reporters saw coming. We had been advocating and reporting on different issues with the trade, but it going viral as like a dirty joke is what led to the actual passing of that act. And I think Mudeng's a good example. I guess my worry is that not a lot of stuff has cute animals. And they're like gold mining, like yes, of course, like that's a huge issue, but like I truly cannot think of anything cutesy that would relate to that. A huge trade in Cambodia is the crocodile skin trade. Not a cute animal. Not a lot of people want to see crocodiles. So I do think that there is a role. My worry is that we're going to put all of our eggs in that basket, and only the cutest animals and very specific stories will be protected. There is like the flagship species mentality. If you protect Mudeng, you protect the entire habitat, and thus everything else. I'm hesitant, and we're definitely getting to the stage now where the mentality of like captive protection is becoming more popular. So if Mudeng's in the wild, we can't protect Mudeng in the wild. Why don't we just take Mudeng and put her into a protected area where people can now watch and view and earn money? So I'm a little nervous about the future of genuine wild conservation, and if that's going to be around for much longer, or if we're just going to put up more fences and more viewing posts where you can see, wild animals. Right. But great question.
I was wondering if you could speak to journalism as a tool for, international relations, diplomacy, bridge work, and what kind of intercultural competencies you've picked up along the way, specifically from your training as a journalist.
Yeah, I think in terms of a framework for international relations, it's like one of the core pillars of it. I would say every ambassador that I know subscribes to different outlets and gathers their news and forms their opinion based off of the news. I know we register actually as Impact the amount of times that our stories make it into embassy reports and State Department memos. So without a doubt, I think because there's a lot of times where countries don't always feel comfortable asking other countries that question, they're happy to watch journalists do it. And I've certainly been approached by folks being different diplomats in all the countries that I work with saying, hey, out of curiosity, are you looking into this issue? Or, oh, we noticed that there was this release. Are you looking into that? Or we saw that you interviewed this ambassador. What were they like? So I do think it is one of the foundational ways to share information among the diplomatic community. In terms of cultural competencies, it's like a constant moving target, I would say. Filipinos and Cambodians love having their pictures taken. Laotians don't. Conservative cultures and the role of women speaking publicly and speaking to strangers, especially male strangers, is drastically different depending on where you go. So we've had issues where we're trying to interview women who are impacted by issues, but they don't feel comfortable speaking and they'd rather let their husbands, sons, or partners speak. And then we walk out with 15 male interviews. So I do think that it changes per country and it is constantly adapting. And it actually changes everything. If somebody offers you alcohol once you enter their house, is it professional to take it, or is that culturally inappropriate if you don't take it? So I do think it's definitely a moving target and something that I try to keep in mind as often as possible, and that's assisted a lot by collaborating with local journalists. So I think that's where I've kind of, it's so much easier to learn about a culture through a colleague and working with them boots on the ground day by day. And now that's made me more comfortable in places like Cambodia and Laos, whereas definitely 3 years ago when I landed, I was very incompetent.
Well, maybe you could follow on this one with a little bit of career advice for people here. People obviously interested in
You heard all of that
journalism.
And you think that I'm ideal for career advice. Yeah, I think we're at a really interesting time. More people can be journalists now than ever, and I truly do believe that. I think that the way that information is spreading is no longer just tied to legacy media like the Times and NBC, and that's really empowering for a lot of folks that do look like me and do have passports like mine and can now reach larger audiences. I think the main concern is now that that's being impacted by influencers and bloggers and everything else. So in that sense, I think there's a lot of positives to a lot of growth in journalism. I'd say the idea of a traditional path where you land a full-time with benefits reporting position is becoming a far less likely. And I think there is still a way to make American local news work and potentially climb the ladder to a regional outlet and then an international outlet and then a global outlet. But I'd say that unfortunately a lot of my friends who are far better journalists are having a very hard time. And just this month we had the largest loss of journalism employment and journalism opportunity through the closure of Voice of America and Radio Free Asia. That's 2,000 jobs gone. So in my 5 years as a professional journalist, that is the largest loss of potential, plus tens of thousands of dollars in freelance work. I collaborated with Radio Free Asia. So now folks like me have lost a major client who covered Asia and covered Asia deeply. So I'd say in terms of career advice, being able to take on any assignment, whether it be photo, video, or text, has kept me afloat, without a doubt. And the ability to pitch globally is key. And I think that leads to the most consistent work. Unfortunately, the New York Times doesn't want local news out of Cambodia, nor does NBC. So how do you consistently tie local issues to the global mindset? And I think places like Georgetown, like Berkeley, are ideal for that because it's kind of training that mindset. And that's helped me a lot. I'd say I would be struggling a lot more if I hadn't spent 7 years in the States, learning about what Americans care about, how to pitch American editors. So I'd say, yeah, learning as many skills as possible so that you can tangibly sell a photo or tangibly sell a video or tangibly sell text. And then having that global ability to pitch stories and kind of connecting the dots.
Well, if you were advising students, let's just hypothetical students, what should they do in their years in college and as they are looking at least the opening, the first crack?
5 years, yes. I'd say the biggest thing is please cut your teeth first. So student news, I think, is an excellent way to actually test out if you do want to be a journalist. I think for all the folks that think journalism is cool, very few actually know what that means or are willing to sacrifice for what it means to be a journalist. So I'd say the number one thing is please try it out. Go in, day out, file your stories, 300 to 500 words, 2 interviews, and churn them out in 6 to 8 hours. And if you can appreciate the grind of journalism, then yes, this career is most likely for you. So I'd say student news is the biggest way to actually try it. Instead of don't let journalism be a theory or you theoretically want to be a journalist, go out and do it. I think the second biggest thing would be a lot of the journalism schools here in the States have these different types of opportunities, whether they be internships or trips or panels or journalism conferences. And I'd say that is what really set me up well for working with the Pulitzer Center and all of these other groups. So I'd say take every opportunity to actually meet journalists and then practice journalism so that you can genuinely assess by the time you graduate, do I want to commit the first 2 to 5 years of my career trying to make this work? And I think that's the biggest thing because I think that breaks the naivety of journalism. Like, oh, everyone can be a reporter. Everyone will be paid well. Everyone will be protected and taken care of. It's just frankly not the case. So I think practicing it and then meeting as many professionals as humanly possible who are doing it in real time is what I would advise any student to do. And then also take other classes as well. I was really hardcore into reporting at Elon, so definitely please take your liberal arts courses seriously, enjoy astronomy, learn other things as well, learn a language.
Well, I have lots of other questions, but I want to make sure I'm not preempting anyone here. So while you, oh yeah, we've got one, good.
Hi, thank you for such a great presentation. I know you mentioned some future work in Micronesia. I was just wondering if you could talk more about that.
You're not going to scoop me, are you? Yeah, so in a stunning turn of events, a gentleman who I was interviewing in Cambodia who was focusing on electrifying parts of the borderland for the government. They wanted to electrify our conflicted borders with Laos and Vietnam so that their military could communicate better. His whole specialty was how do you electrify places that really cannot be electrified? He was deployed to Micronesia, and he is now electrifying 18 of the most remote islands in Micronesia. So we were catching up, and he was like, actually, we'll be here for the next 18 months, and we'll be working on climate resilient infrastructure, solar grids, response teams for downed power lines, and literally building up an entire grid from scratch, which to me was absolutely mind-boggling. And I was like, how are you planning on doing this? And he's like, we have no idea. Well, we're going to figure it out bit by bit. So I thought that was really worth a story to the Pulitzer Center also because Micronesia is one of the Pacific islands that's less covered. So my goal, if things go well, would be to pitch the Pulitzer Center and ask for a certain amount of money to get deployed to Chuuk, which is the main island that I would visit and report from, and then meet this gentleman, report on that, and then hopefully create side stories. So interestingly enough, Chuuk, this very particular island, was a major naval base for the Japanese during World War II. and was absolutely obliterated. And 80 years later, this is the 80th anniversary of the end of the war, the Japanese are going back and cleaning up the downed ships so that their oil doesn't leak into the ocean. And that's in this very particular island in Micronesia, which I was like, well, that's a fascinating side story that we could pursue in conjunction with our main piece. So yes, I'll be pitching that later this week, and then as part of the Pulitzer Center process, I'll need to bring in an interested newsroom. The good news is I can't think of a single newsroom that's had a recent byline out of Chuuk, Micronesia. So I'm hopeful that there'll be a lot of interest of like, oh, if you can pay for it, and you can get there and report these interesting stories and take these pictures, like, yeah, sure, we'll publish that. So we'll be going to some of our old clients and trying to pitch them. So that's hopefully the Chuuk story, and the goal would be to go in June or July, depending on funding and all of that. And it is a massive pain in the butt to get to Chuuk, as I've learned. So I'd go from Phnom Penh to Bangkok to Singapore to Guam, and then Guam to Chuuk. So it will be a bit of
On
a
an
logistic.
airplane.
On an airplane, thank God.
All of it on an airplane.
All on a plane. Also not good for the environment. But yes, so that's the loose plan that Anne and I will hopefully talk about over the next few days as I pitch this out.
Great. Well, while people are cogitating on their questions, you were promising us a little bit more on the gold mining.
Yes.
But one of the intriguing bits of it is the way that AI and ChatGPT, I presume, are, of course, revolutionizing our lives. But how do you see that playing out? Does it mean nobody needs to learn how to write anymore?
Oh God, I hope not. I hope not. That's one of the things we're selling. Yeah, I'm overarchingly, I think with the attitude that my editor and I took with it was, is there a way that we can work with this ethically and helpfully? But it cannot replace the journalism. So our biggest goal was like AI-supported reporting, not AI-produced reporting. And that was a really hard thing to kind of come to terms with. In terms of the future, gosh, if I knew the future of AI, I'd be wearing a much nicer suit. I'd say that it, in the immediate sense, will lead to a loss of career opportunities for folks as we replace expensive people with AI-supported production, whether that be with graphic design or copy editing or actually translations now. So a lot of interpreters I know are petrified that they're going to be outclassed by different AI platforms, AI tools with languages. So I'd say I'm overarchingly concerned. The good news is I don't think you can get rid of journalism. And no matter what AI can produce based off of hundreds of years of past reporting, it can't beat journalistic instinct and that human touch that I think a lot of reporters have because of the fact that they create personal relationships with sources and countries and topics. I don't think that has yet been replaced by AI. But it is certainly a concern, especially on the visual side of things. So would they want to send me to Chuuk, or could we just generate an image based off of every image of Chuuk, and that's what we'll use instead of having to send you all the way? So I am overarchingly concerned. But I do think journalism will adapt, and we're going to find a way to ethically work with it, or at least some newsrooms will.
And on your gold mining story, how did you get into it, and what did you learn about sort of the AI?
Yeah, so the pitch, when we got the grant, we were not collaborating with AI. Gold mining was just booming in Cambodia, and I really wanted to report on it. They picked my project to partner with Cambridge and Earth Genome because it was like a landscape scale project, and it was easier to track open pit mining, which is what we do for gold, than it would be for other extractive industries, which are a bit more hidden under tree canopy. So I guess the way that it all started was I informed the team of where I wanted to go, which was a historical gold mining community. They canvassed that based on satellite imagery, and then created a model that could identify other places that looked really similar. And frankly, that was the extent of I guess my collaboration with AI. I wasn't coding or creating the predictive model that would send me to these places. But once we had our full list of points that we had to check, I was the dummy that they sent to go around the country checking, is that actually a gold mine or is that not? And we found a bunch of weird stuffs. We found a couple sand mines. We found a couple of just gravel pits. But that was kind of how that AI how I collaborated with AI, which was, I would say, pretty limited. I think we have far better folks at the Pulitzer Center who are more adept at that than I am.
Well, one other question while we're still waiting for people to come up with their ideas. obviously we're looking at a huge disaster that's happening now in Myanmar, but also has affected Bangkok.
Yep.
How do you see contemporary journalism in these situations of just dramatic catastrophe, and particularly with the very special situation of Myanmar, Burma?
I think that's so interesting because I've been thinking about it and watching my colleagues who are out covering the earthquake. I'd say contemporary journalism where we come into effect isn't inherently the breaking news. We didn't break news of the earthquake in the news. That broke on social media, where people felt the earthquake, watched buildings collapse, watched pools explode, and that news was broken by public citizens who were impacted directly. I think where journalists come in now is, what are our building codes? How many buildings were similarly built? How many people are in a radius where if a building collapsed, this would impact you? So I think for the Bangkok infrastructure side, I think that's where the reporting is going to come in. What are our codes? Who's following them? Are there loopholes? Which buildings are too old? And I see that's where, that's why you'd want a reporter versus somebody who's just witnessing. Myanmar is exceedingly complicated. I think, I know folks that haven't wanted to go in because of the high amount of risk that would lead to for local colleagues. Like, we'd naturally need to work with Burmese reporters, and now I'm going to take my colleagues straight into, conflict zones where they can't inherently leave. I, as a foreign correspondent, could most likely leave, whereas with a Burmese passport, perhaps that wouldn't be possible. So I think contemporary journalism in places, very difficult places like Myanmar, would have to work in conjunction, in collaboration with, I guess, what we would call citizen journalism. Folks that are just recording and covering what's happening. That's how we've actually recorded a vast majority of the war crimes that have happened. All the aerial bombardments of hospitals and schools were not covered by journalists. They were posted on social media apps by people who were there. And journalists then took that, put it into context, put that onto BBC and all these other outlets. So I think in countries like Myanmar, perhaps in places like Syria and Gaza as well, we'll need to collaborate with people who have better access to what's going on and work with them to, I guess, spread that information.
I mean, it's a classic case of where the first estimates were that there were, 60 people, and then all of a sudden you're seeing thousands, and now today it's 1,700.
Yep. And then
So that raises a question of who is the aggregator? Who's doing the overall analysis?
Elon Musk. I think, unfortunately, we're at the stage where all of the, even news now, most of our hits are coming from social media. So I've had, our NBC package that aired, we had more views on Instagram and X than we did on YouTube and on NBC proper, on the website. So I do think all of our news is being aggregated by a handful of folks that run these platforms, especially in Asia, where we're all on WhatsApp, we're all on Facebook, and that's all under one company. So I'd say, I think we're all trying to figure that out. The algorithm does keep changing, and I think there's been a little bit less transparency about how that algorithm is changing and who it's meant to be benefiting. But unfortunately, I don't think we've figured out how else to spread, our information. So I'm a bit, overarchingly, a bit concerned about that as well.
Well, we've always said journalism is the first version of history. And then I guess there's sort of a next version, which is, the magazines or the sort of longer form journalism, and then the academics come to the rescue. But it is fascinating. What's the story going to be of this earthquake? I think you're absolutely right that it's going to be building codes and corruption and all of the other things that we see so often. But what else might it be? Maybe people coming to the rescue. I mean, local response, including religious, for example.
Yeah, that's been the coverage now. We'll be focusing on, how quickly were our responders able to pull out the 47 construction workers who were trapped in that collapsed building in Bangkok. Naturally, I think religion will play a huge part in the aftershocks of, mourning families and folks trying to figure out who was lost during this catastrophe. So I do think religion will come into that. But I also think we're in an interesting phase where it almost seems like social media and journalism are both the first drafts of history. And that's both concerning and wonderful in a lot of different ways. But I'm curious as well as how this will continue.
Yeah.
I think we had a similar awful instance, was it a year and a half ago when we had the school shooting in Thailand, which is very rare in Thailand. And we kind of saw that story evolve into gun reform, into the king getting involved and taking care of those that were murdered, and then the Thai justice system and what that looks like. So I think the stories will continue to evolve using this really horrible Keystone
Yeah.
moment to hopefully make change.
So,
I wanted to follow up on a different angle about the earthquake, and that's one of priorities, right? So a major earthquake or any other natural disaster happens, and then the government, journalists are all focused on this very specific thing. How do you see that intersecting with, say, the government's ability to prioritize fighting corruption, fighting environmental degradation, sort of prioritizing things that it may have been starting to focus on because of journalism, and then something else happens? And likewise for journalism, how do you prioritize the immediate and the aftermath and following up rightly on that story while also continuing all of the work that you've been doing in the background on bigger environmental issues?
I think that's constantly a question that I'm asking, especially in countries like Cambodia. Like we most likely could use a new airport, and that will inherently help the country develop and bring more tourists in. But naturally, what's the cost of that? So I would say it's a constant debate. I think disasters like these definitely take attention away. I think what's been happening here in DC with the White House, like that's absolutely been the focus of most of our region as well, and how old alliances whether they'll be maintained or change. But I think that is just the media industry. There are so few politicians and governments that are so centrally focused on a single topic that I feel like in most of our region, we're constantly just putting out fires where they pop up. The good news is I do think that the environment has been a consistent and steady topic of interest, perhaps because of natural disasters and because we keep getting reminded why this is important. So I do think I see that maintaining, and unfortunately for us, we are one of the most climate vulnerable regions in the world. So we'll be paying for it first. Regardless of our emissions and our contributions to climate change, we will get hit first and hardest. And I think that will naturally make it more of a government's priority. I guess my concern is how many lives will be lost, how much damage are we willing to take on before we realize that we need to start making drastic changes. So yeah, I'd say it's kind of like a bit of a whack-a-mole in a lot of cases, because we'll be working on long-form investigative projects, and then an earthquake happens, or a wildfire happens, and suddenly you've had to set aside all of your investigative reporting and cover the news. So kind of a constantly shifting target as well.
well, following up with something that's in the news, have you thought about covering what China is doing and the role of China in Cambodia? I mean, it's one of the countries where supposedly there's some tilting going on.
Yeah, my story that I filed this morning is about President Xi Jinping's upcoming visit to Cambodia, so definitely a huge topic. I think we're going to cover it as, I think unfortunately we will always cover it because of the outlets that I'm working on with like a US angle. So in that sense, it'll be more of a competitive lens. Is this countering US influence? Is this replacing US influence? Does Ream Naval Base in Cambodia, how does that affect American security in the Indo-Pacific? So because of my clients, I think we'll come at it from a US first lens, and then I'm wondering if by reporting with groups like Nikkei Asia and the Japan Times, that'll kind of give it a more balanced approach, or not more balanced, but a broader angle for it. But I'm sorry, that probably didn't answer your question.
Yeah, but how do you assess it? I mean, it's not easy for anyone, I think, even a good spy would find it, I think, a little difficult to figure out exactly what's going on.
Yeah, a lot of our governments are pretty closed off in terms of what their plans are. So I'd say that the way that I'm assessing it, or that I'm watching it, is that it looks like countries like Cambodia are trying to balance different superpowers. Because nobody wants to be completely in the pocket of one, and then basically state sovereignty is, vanquished. So I think a lot of our countries in our region are concerned that if the US does pull out, who would replace the states? Would it be the EU? Doesn't look like it with everything going on in Ukraine and Russia. So actually, what we're seeing for the first time is massive state visits to Arab nations, which is absolutely fascinating. For the first time, our prime minister is visiting Qatar and Riyadh and Cairo, and we have not seen that at all in the past few years, and there's been very little, I guess, Arab influence on our side of the world. So I think everyone is very happy and willing to work with China and Beijing on different infrastructure and funding projects, but I know a lot of folks have a lot of reservations about only getting their funding from one place. So at least all of the politicians and diplomats that I've spoken to and interviewed, everyone said everyone's just trying to find this balance. Like, we do absolutely want Beijing-backed infrastructure. Yes, I'll take the airport. Yes, I'll take the new highway. But I also want to make sure that our entire system is not based off of this. So I am very curious to see where all of our countries go. I think my concern is if we're all looking for the next funder, there's probably not enough to go around, right? And so I'm a little bit curious as to if we all start gunning for the Arabs, like, will they have enough, I guess, interest in foreign aid and influence in Asia to support all of these governments? And I'm not sure.
But I guess part of my question is about another one of our fundamental issues, which journalism is all about, which is evidence and truth.
Yeah.
So how do you think, what would be good ways to investigate the role of China? I mean, obviously there's the cocktail party circuit. And,
Yeah.
you know, which loan's been approved,
Yeah.
or and then you see people. So you get, but I'm wondering if there's, because it's complicated.
It's exceedingly complicated. I can only speak from experience. I guess so the story that we most recently did, Nikkei's rule, was 4 separate, unrelated, independent sources. So every single claim that you make, you better have 4 people who you did not speak to at the same time, who do not work for the same company, that confirmed that they heard the same thing, or they have evidence that that happened. So I guess to confirm that this upcoming visit was happening, we were sent pictures of a meeting between security forces. And they said, oh, that's Cambodian security meeting with Chinese security to discuss the president's upcoming visit. Then I had to go out and get 3 other people to say, did you hear about a meeting earlier this week between security forces? And just like that constant need for a great deal of verification. I think we're pretty data deficient, unfortunately, when it comes to a lot of this. And then a lot of the data that is released about Chinese aid and infrastructure and loan programs are all government. I wouldn't say that there are very few independent sources that have credible data. So all of our information is what different governments want us to know and what they're willing to share with us. And that leads to other concerns as well. So yeah, I would say I'm figuring it out. I'm breaking into, I guess, the term for it when you pitch it is China outside of China. So Chinese foreign influence, and I'm still trying to figure that out myself. We've been mostly doing environmental pieces, but as freelance, you do have to kind of adapt with the times.
Any other questions? I have a couple more, but we can also go to the reception pretty soon. But first of all, why Cambodia? How did you pick Cambodia to spend, 3 years?
3 years, yeah. Fear of unemployment, I'd say that was the largest thing. Fear of going home unemployed, second largest thing.
But it was there, but you had a chance, a specific
yes.
chance. But did you make the chance, or did the chance happen to you?
I guess the chance, I applied to a job in Cambodia and got it, so I guess that's a mix.
Yeah.
When I finished up my optional practical training, which is the work extension to your student visa that a lot of F1 student visa holders have in the States. When I finished that, the big debate was, I tried to become an American, going through the local news system and hope not to get laid off in the next 15 years? Like, okay, that didn't seem likely. And I was really keen to break into international reporting. So I applied for postings all over, and I landed a 6-month contract in Cambodia. And then kind of reflecting on it now, while that was absolutely luck, I think I really got, I was really fortunate. It was a dollarized economy. It was, it's at the heart of the Mekong Basin, so it's a critical place to discuss the Mekong River and Chinese influence. It was politically a very interesting time. We got to cover the first change in leadership in 40 years from our prime minister to his eldest son. So I think I got very lucky in that sense. But that was why Cambodia. I think journalists, at least the way that I saw it, is that you have to put yourself where news is happening and put yourself in a place where you're not going to get crushed by competition. If I was reporting in DC, I think I'd get pulverized. I don't think I'd land a single pitch here, or in places like New York or London. So it's where there are less journalists, where there are less bureaus, and how can I fill that gap of coverage in countries like Cambodia. And that's expanded now to Laos and Vietnam, also places where people don't have a lot of in-country staff.
So why Bangkok?
Bangkok is for work. So I've been living in Cambodia for the past 3 years, and I start paying rent in Thailand tomorrow. Unfortunately, really unfortunate timing, seeing as I just got an apartment in Bangkok. But yeah, I mean, of my 9 clients, 5 have Asia Pacific bureaus in Bangkok. So the goal being that we're already, while I'm based in Phnom Penh, we travel so much for work, that I would just change hubs and be still hopefully consistently covering the kingdom, covering Cambodia and the rest of the region. But instead from Bangkok, we're also, press freedoms are a little bit more loose, or a bit more free. So that's also why Bangkok.
Yeah. Well, one of the things you again touched on during your presentation is another hot issue, which is figuring out what is the impact of the U.S. government's changes. You've, I think, focused mainly on the landmine programs, but there are lots of others, I think.
Tons.
And how do you see that? I guess we should focus on what's the story.
Yeah.
How does the story evolve as opposed to the raw analysis of what's behind it and where it's going and all the other questions we have?
So just speaking about what I've covered, the story that we landed with the Japan Times was about, will the US's uncertainty force other countries to become better allies? So the Philippines and Japan are allied through the US. So will US uncertainty about their commitment to the Asia Pacific force the Philippines and Japan to interact more bilaterally without the US in play? So that was a big story for us, both in Manila and in Tokyo. In terms of, I guess, aid cuts, I think the story that we're going to be looking at is trust. Regardless of what happens, what are we, halfway through the 90-day free? Okay, so let's say miraculously everything turns around and all the aid is returned. Would receiving countries be as willing to collaborate with American partners? I think that's a big question that we're going to see occur for the next few years. And then also, what was the loss of qualification and expertise during this period? So all the folks that left their jobs with USAID or elsewhere, will we have that talent? Would we be able to bring them back on and kind of start where we left off? Or would we have to kind of restart relations? So I'd say those are the two big stories that I'm watching, and then also who's going to come in to replace the states. So if the US is pulling out of landmine clearance, will it be Japan or China that comes in? If the US is pulling out of HIV tests and all these other topics, who will be the ally? If the US pulls out of the Indo-Pacific and is less interested in West Philippine Sea and South China Sea issues, will Australia come in? Will they be the next big player in our region? Or will it be a void for the next few years until we figure that out? So I'd say the amount of stories coming out of this are massive, and I think President Trump will keep us very busy as reporters for the next few years, which is, I guess, in that sense, a good thing.
Yeah. I haven't seen many stories coming out of Cambodia because it's very focused on Africa, I think, where the proportions are larger. But
Much larger. Yeah, but we had the same cuts. I mean, HIV
Yeah.
testing in Cambodia was all funded through USAID, as were maternal health clinics.
yeah.
I think a big issue with countries like Cambodia is we developed such a huge donation and foreign aid industry that our government and many other governments around the region have decided, oh, we don't need to invest in ever funding that because the Americans will always be there to assist us with maternal health, with HIV screening, with tuberculosis screening. And unfortunately, with the cuts, it's like, oh, we are not prepared to take on those costs. So we've immediately switched to, is there another funder that could come in, which isn't always the right attitude. Like, is there a point where we need to become more self-sufficient in what you would consider basic, health and infrastructure concerns?
Well, and of course, the Berkeley Center question is always what's religion got to do with it? So I'm wondering, I haven't actually seen anything, but there are a number of groups, evangelical groups, groups working with refugees that have a religious orientation that have had USAID funding.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering how they're responding. And
At the moment, I'm wondering if we're going to see a huge loss in all of these organizations. Not only will major groups like the United Nations have to take massive cuts on their staff and their deployment, but these smaller religious-based groups could they rely on their congregation to fund this work? I couldn't imagine so. So I wonder if we're actually going to see, kind of like after COVID, like a huge shutdown, and we'll see who survives. And then whoever's left will be the major players next year. Because I think a lot of the funding is cutting at the end of this fiscal year. So it's who of the religious groups of these foreign aid organizations are still standing a year from today. And that's who we're going to be deciding is the next big player. So I think that's kind of like a wait and see game, especially in Cambodia, because you're right, like there were so many groups impacted by the.
Well, they're
the
working
USAID
on
cuts.
environment issues, but I think a lot on the refugees. I think that's been a major area of focus.
Yeah, less of an issue in Cambodia. I think most of the refugees from Myanmar have been in Thailand.
Yeah,
and that's where the big
yeah, that's true.
the big focus
Yeah.
has been. So yeah, I guess we'll see. Hopefully, we'll get to cover it to see what do these camps and areas look like after the 90-day freeze, and has anyone stepped in, or will we actively have to disband refugee camps and send folks home, which would be
Yeah,
pretty catastrophic.
yeah. So, any last questions?
I saw you raise your hand and hesitate.
Hi, you kind of answered the question, but I was just wondering how, if you can compare the tone of journalism in the United States to the tone of journalism in South Asia, particularly in the native languages. I'm just curious what the tone is.
Yeah, I'd say tone in local languages, because literacy rates in local languages shift quite dramatically. Like the number one way that news is consumed in Cambodia is through the radio, because Khmer literacy rates are not the highest. So even that aspect has changed. So in terms of tone, I'd say that we're a bit more cut and dry. Like when I was working with Cambodian journalists and Laotian journalists, there isn't this idea of narrative leads and human focus, or a human investment and emotional. It's more of like getting the facts out. And I think a really good example of that was like the Radio Free Asia model. Like they were almost like a wire. It was like, here's 5 paragraphs with all the news, and that's it. And there wasn't a deeper sense of analysis. It was just what is happening and get it out as quickly as possible, because there was such an information gap. So I'm wondering, that's like the biggest thing that I see. When I work for the Times or the AP, everybody will ask, but so what? What's the greater context here? Why does that matter? And what could that mean in the future? Whereas I think for a lot of local languages, we're just trying to get information out. So that secondary question isn't always covered. And I would say that, like, definitely working in a local newsroom where we had a Cambodian arm and then an international arm, you could feel that difference. And there was just, it wasn't a lack of interest, it was just a lack, that wasn't the priority. We don't need to know about, what the greater context is, we just need to know what is happening today and who is going to be most impacted. So I'm hopeful, I think that's a bit different back home in the Philippines, where we have a bit more of a developed press corps. Obviously, Indonesia has a much larger press contingent as well. But then for countries like Cambodia, Vietnam, Laos, where the media is so restricted, folks are really just focusing in the local languages of getting information out as quickly as possible. So I'd say that was the biggest difference working with local and international outlets.
Well, I'm sure there are people here that are ready to scoop you, but could you give us maybe, as we come to the close, some of the thoughts of future stories and what you're looking at and what you think we should be following?
For us, it's a big anniversary year. So 50 years since the end of the Vietnam War, which also means 50 years since the takeover of the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia, which also means 50 years since the, depending on your political views, the victory in Laos or the fall of Laos to communism. And then on top of that, the 80th anniversary of the end of World War II. So those tie-ins naturally resonate with readers. So that will be instantly a big pitch for this year, which is why I think if we do end up going to Micronesia, that will be an instant pitch. You put 80 years after the war, we're still cleaning up war remnants, pretty easily sold. So that's, I guess, an overarching theme that I'm focusing on. We're in the middle of smoke season right now, so our slash and burn agriculture industry in Southeast Asia leads to really terrible air smog and air pollution. So once I land, we re-gear up and I deploy to northern Thailand to report on the wildfires there and the mass burnings that's creating a huge health concern in that sense. So I'd say that's a big story for us and is consistently a big story. And then other big topics that I'm following, I'm curious how Beijing will play this. This is the first international visit of the Chinese president into mainland Southeast Asia. So his choice of Cambodia, Vietnam, and Malaysia I found really fascinating. And I think that's something that I'm going to kind of continue to try to cover and understand better. Other than that, I think Signal chats are been in the news lately. That's a big one that I've been following out of sheer awe. I think the biggest story in all of Asia in relation to the States is, will the U.S. remain in the Asia Pacific, or will there be a push to leave and talk of leaving, like leaving NATO and all of this? Because I'd say that in terms of national sovereignty and security is the biggest thing. So the Secretary of Defense was just in the Philippines, and I think that was a huge, that was kind of a big weight. It looks like the Americans are indeed interested in remaining very present and very active militarily in the Asia Pacific and in the Indo-Pacific. So I'd say that overarchingly will be our biggest story this year. In the first year of the second Trump administration, will alliances maintain, or will they start to shift, and perhaps we'll go into a more mercantile view of, we're happy to defend you, but what do you give us? Or will it continue to be kind of the status quo that we've seen the last few years? So I'd say that actually is the biggest story that all of our governments are following very closely. And actually no one seems to know the complete answer just yet.
Well, I think the story of the Khmer Rouge anniversary is really quite a dramatic one. It is, and it is sort of, on the one hand, is that really the way we should be thinking in terms of anniversaries?
Yeah.
But we do. I mean,
Yeah.
we just looked at the 5-year anniversary of COVID,
yeah.
and sort of what we did. But
Yeah.
but it is also true that particularly these 50-year, 80-year, a lot of people didn't live it.
Yes.
So
And we're at the last vestiges of those who did are still around.
yeah.
So I think that's why, for journalism, once you get an anniversary into your pitch, like, it helps a lot. Like, it's the 8th year anniversary since then. It's like, 10, 25, 50, folks are a bit more interested. For the Khmer Rouge, we're still at the stage where I'd say everyone over the age of 55 or so is guaranteed to have been a survivor.
Yeah.
So that still impacts daily mindsets consistently. For World War II, this is kind of it. I mean, we covered World War II, not celebrations, commemorations in Manila, and they found two veterans in the country. So I do think we're kind of at this final stage of the people who lived it and helped build the current world that we're in are passing on. And I wonder if actually, people will be less interested, once that tie to living human beings has passed. I don't see a lot about World War I anniversaries. And I think the next big one will be Vietnam. Once that group of veterans start to pass, and that generation that lived through Vietnam, that lived through the civil rights movement, I wonder how will we keep talking about that and keep
Yeah.
reporting on it in the future, or is that now officially a history book chapter? And we won't see that in the news anymore. I'm not so sure.
Well, I think we've come to the end of this phase, but thank you so much for a fascinating presentation.
thank you so much for having
and
me.
a delightful conversation. And thank you to the courageous souls who forego the sunny day in Washington and the cherry blossoms to
I was going to say, this
hear you.
is the best weather I've ever seen in DC. I really appreciate you guys picking me over it.
Great.
But thank you so much.